Hi, I'm Tom Friedland, president of the Berkeley City Club. I want to welcome everyone to this evening's program. Let me address, first of all, club members, thank you for your membership and thank you for attending tonight's program. Non-club members who live in the Bay Area, I'd like to encourage you to apply for membership in the Berkeley City Club. If you're not familiar with the club, it's a spectacular building, a block from campus on Durant Avenue on the south side, block and a half below Telegraph Avenue. We have an indoor swimming pool. We have a lot of events. We have one of the better restaurants in Berkeley, Julia's. You can try it for either in-person or curbside pickup. And if you have out-of-town guests, I encourage you to have them stay at our Berkeley City Club Hotel. And if you are not in the Bay Area, I encourage you, when you do come to Berkeley, to do the same things, to eat at our Julia's restaurant, to swim in our pool when you stay at our hotel. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to my wife, Sandy, who is in charge of our arts and culture program.
Half in charge of arts and culture. I have a co-chair, Wendy Rubin. Okay, happy Groundhog Day, everyone. Before we begin, I want to remind you that you can submit questions for our two guests this evening by using the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And also, we'll be using a split screen tonight for the two speakers, which you can view best if you select speaker rather than gallery view. So I had more trouble than usual working on the introduction to tonight's program, because all I wanted to do was to keep listening to the audio work of both our featured guest, Anna Sale, and her friend and colleague, Casey Miner. Both are incredibly talented communicators, finding ever more fascinating subjects to weave into terrific podcasts and radio shows. Anna hosts the award-winning weekly podcast, Death, Sex, and Money. Since May 2014, she has calmly asked her guests probing questions about the awkward subjects that most of us avoid. She listens carefully to their answers and then poses the perfect follow-ups. As a reviewer in The Guardian wrote, Sale has an almost uncanny ability for getting people to open up to her. The Washington Post reviewer adds, it's easy to get swept up in the audio program, struck and stirred by the honesty Sale extracts from her guests. Those guests include marquee names as well as people like the rest of us. Just to give you some idea of the range of topics she has covered, here are a few recent ones: body image, grief, cheating, divorce, one-night stand, shoplifting, and a dramatic loss of income. Luckily for us, Anna has distilled what she has learned from her podcast, her former career as a political journalist, and her own relationships in her new book, How to Talk About Hard Things. A combination of memoir, short narrative, and advice, this book has earned glowing reviews. Anna writes convincingly about the value of discussing the difficult parts of a relationship, urging her readers to address what we normally shy away from, like, as you probably have guessed, sex, death, and money, as well as family and identity. And she tells us how to broach those topics. But as the reviewer in the New Yorker notes, Anna is not dispensing tough love, but empathy. Her book is not unlike a good conversation with a friend. And speaking of good conversations with a friend, Casey Miner will be the one asking questions of Anna tonight. Casey is an accomplished writer, editor, and producer who specializes in long-form narrative pieces for radio. Although we often don't hear her voice, her work off mic ensures that the stories we do hear are clear, compelling, and so often unforgettable. The list of programs that Casey has helped to shape read like a who's who of the top shows on public radio. Among them are Reveal, public radio's first hour-long investigative program, Marketplace, The Takeaway, Transportation Nation, and The Stoop, a podcast focusing on Blackness, race, and identity in America. For a couple of years, Casey had her very own KALW podcast called The Specialist. It focused on people with unusual jobs, such as a woman who crafts the fake injuries for training first responders, and a man who teaches monks to use YouTube. Casey also has taught audio production at UC Berkeley and belongs to the Editors Collective, 4 editors who specialize in audio narrative and are committed to bringing more voices into their industry. When I asked Casey what drew her to audio as opposed to print journalism or documentary filmmaking, she said, "I love that people could speak as themselves with their own cadence and inflection." She added that she enjoys working on pieces from inception to broadcast, a process that includes pitching stories, booking interviews, recording in the field, cutting tape, script writing, editing, mixing, voicing, and hosting. So it's certainly time to stop hearing from me and start listening to the voices of the real pros, Anna Sale and Casey Miner. You're on.
Hi, Anna.
Hi, Casey. Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Sandy. Just beautiful. I'm excited to talk with you, Casey.
Yes, thank you so much. That was lovely. And, let's do it. Let's talk about hard things.
Let's do it.
So apropos of the lovely intro, I wanted to start out by asking you, you do have this podcast. It is called Death, Sex, and Money. You've hosted it for, I think, 7 years now. And I'm curious, given that you have this platform, that you've gotten to talk to many, many people and also to share those conversations with so many people, why do the book? What do we get from the book that we don't get from the show? And what did you get from it that is different?
I mean, I think that it's, as any writer who's listening will recognize, there's, you do, and then you don't really know what you're doing until someone asks you to explain what you have been doing. So that's what writing the book was for me. I found that my career has always been in public radio, first as a reporter and primarily as an interviewer these last 7 years. And people would ask, like, I'd be invited to classes. How do you have a successful interview? How do you get people to open up? And I found that I was sort of like trying to describe how my muscles worked without ever really thinking about and studying how the muscles worked. And so the book was my attempt to put to words my practice, and also to make the distinction between the kinds of interviews I do at work, which are, very personal, and in controlled environments, and most often with people who have not met me before and won't meet me in person again. That's one kind of difficult conversation, but much more difficult in most of our lives are the ones that we have with the people we love, where the stakes are high and where there's history to navigate around. And, so I wanted to try to take what I'd learned from doing interviews and, tell stories of when I had fallen short in my own life by trying to have hard conversations that didn't turn out the way that I had hoped they would. But also that I do think there are some lessons from what I do in an interview to broach topics with people we love, most primarily about preparing for the conversation. I think that can set you up to have a much more successful conversation about a hard thing than if you just finally let it overflow and start a hard conversation without kind of thinking about the timing.
It's interesting that you bring up the similarities and the differences between doing having these conversations on the podcast versus having them in real life, because there's a phrase that comes up actually repeatedly throughout the book, which is the limits of our control. And I get the sense, both from knowing you and from reading the book, that you might not be a person who loves the fact that there are limits to control. I am also that sort of person. And so I wanted to ask you how you think about that idea, especially in light of what you were just saying about the importance of kind of preparing for these conversations that you have in real life, and the fact that it's possible to do so. Like, it's your choices are not actually host a podcast or overflow all at once. There's this middle ground, but there are real hard limits. And so I'm curious if you could talk about that a little bit and kind of how that theme found its way into the book.
Yeah, I mean, when I embarked on this project of talking about hard things, I thought, is this basically what every book of literature has ever attempted to Like, what do I have to add here? And what do I have to say about getting through a hard thing that many other people haven't turned over before many times? And what I wanted to really sort of meditate on in this book was that this book is not one that offers hacks or fixes or ways out of hard things. It starts with the premise that these things are part of our lives, and whether it's grief, or whether it's not having the resources you need, money, or whether it's having a relationship turn out a way that you hadn't hoped and wished for, these are not things that we can always control. And I think often what can make it so difficult to talk about stuff where we aren't confronting the limits of our control is, we want to present like we have sort of like figured something out, like, yes, this is tough, but here's my next step for how I'm going to make my way through this. Or if we're the person who's listening to someone talk about a hard thing, it's very easy to move into that first instinct of like, what comfort can I offer? Instead of creating the space to be with the person who is struggling. And I think that is something that I learned first through my work, and learned it in a really sort of mercenary way in radio. You are taught very early on, the saying is, don't step on the tape. So if someone is expressing something tough, I learned very early on to sort of sit back and let them finish their thought, and let there be space, and not to rush to say, oh, I'm so sorry, or, kind of fill the discomfort. And I think that I do that more in my own life as well. And I think that that's like really served my relationships, because then I'm letting the people I love tell me what's going on instead of immediately rushing to try to be helpful, which can get in the way of intimacy.
Do you do it right all the time?
Oh, no. No, but when I do it, I'm quick to recognize when I am not doing it how I hope to do it. Because I think, it's grief, for example, who hasn't wanted to say the thing to someone who's deep in grief that will offer some comfort, because otherwise you're both looking into the void, and it's sad and it's scary. And it takes courage to say, I'm so sorry, and just let your friend or your loved one be sad. But I think that it's, if you yourself have been in grief, you might recognize also like some of the pressure that comes with being in grief is that you have to figure out how to manage the feelings of people who are trying to be comforting to you, how to show that you recognize that they're trying to be helpful. And that takes a lot of energy,
Mm-hmm. There's another phrase in the book that this is making me think about in terms of creating space, which is radical acceptance. And that is not an original concept, but you talk about it a little bit. And I wonder if you could just tell people what that is, and also how you think about that relating it, I think, to grief in particular, but also to just this fact of messiness. Because I think, it's funny, I hear you talk about this and I think, yes, absolutely, hard stuff, part of life, no question. We all know that. But I mean, when really the rubber hits the road, I am very much, and I think a lot of people are like, well, I know I can do stuff. I'm very competent. I'm going to figure out how to just fix all this. I'm going to fix all of it now. And it's that the transition from that intellectual understanding that that's not possible to that peaceful emotional place where you can just kind of be with a feeling or be with somebody, I think I certainly find it hard to make that leap, and I think other people do too. So that phrase radical acceptance also stuck out to me, and I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that actually comes up in the chapter I write about talking about money, and it was in an interview that I was doing with a woman who runs student affairs, is in a student affairs office at Sacramento State. Her name is Danielle Munoz, and she was talking to me about when she started her career, she just, sort of her office doors open for students who are having any kind of crisis. And I interviewed her a couple of years ago and then talked to her several times. And she said, now it used to be I'd hear about a lot of different things. And now it's all rent related. Now it's all about housing instability. And a large majority of her students are first generation college students. They're taking out loans. They're trying to figure out how to get through school. And the math doesn't add up in the way that they expected, and in a way that feels totally demoralizing and crushing for her and for the students she's trying to help. And so what she does when they come into her office is she talks about radical acceptance, which is this idea of we don't have to like this situation, but we need to look clearly at this situation and say, okay, this is what your rent is right now. This is the amount of money you need to get through this semester to finish your credits. And if you fail to finish your credits in this semester, then you're going to be that much further behind from your degree. And it's not, you're going to, the math is going to get even more complicated. So it's about saying, okay, like, do you need to take out more in loans? Are there other ways you can earn more money? Can you apply for these other grants? Like really taking a holistic look at the amount of money that they have access to, and then helping them make a decision that works right now, that's based on life right now, even as they are shaking their fist at what feels like something fundamentally broken about opportunity in America, about housing in California, et cetera. And she feels that way too. So it's both saying, we don't like these facts, we have to face these facts. So that's how she describes radical acceptance. And so then they can make a choice to move forward. And I think it's something that can be, often what can be so tricky about talking about hard things is it's hard to face facts sometimes, not just with money, but also in our relationships, for example, like I write about talking about change in relationship, whether it's, you stay together or you're deciding to move apart, or also if you're in a long-term monogamous relationship, how to like make room to acknowledge that change is happening inside a relationship just because of the passage of time. It can be kind of tricky to address things like aging or how each other's bodies are changing, or what's different about your relationship since one of you has gone through an illness. And so radical acceptance is just this sort of like, I love it because it's this idea of saying like, we don't have to like this, but let's be honest together about what's going on.
You've set me up very well for this next part, which is that, you have many of these conversations on the podcast, and I have noticed that you do not always share on the show in very much detail about your own personal life and your personal experiences in the depth that you do in the book. And in the book, there are many very personal anecdotes about exactly these kinds of things. And I'm wondering if you would read a passage, the passage that opens the sex chapter, which I think might be my favorite. This is actually my favorite passage in the entire book, which you know. But I'd like you to read it, and then I'll ask you about it a little bit. But I do think it gets at some of what you're saying.
Okay, and you just stop me when you've heard enough. I should say, I'm not sure we made it clear to the audience that we are both also based in Berkeley. So Kate's in Berkeley in her home right now. I'm in Berkeley in my home right now. We're both Berkeley residents. And this is a very East-based story because it starts in an exam room at Kaiser in Oakland. Sitting in the sterile exam room at a Kaiser hospital in Oakland, a male OBGYN gives me post-baby intimacy tips. Inside, I burn with mortification, but I refuse to flinch from his steady eye contact. I'd come to the doctor's office about a year after my first daughter was born to have my Nexplanon contraception implant taken out of my arm, joking that it hadn't been terribly needed in the last few months. I did not expect that offhand remark to lead to a series of follow-up questions from a dude doctor I had just met about the infrequency of sex after giving birth and how I felt about it. But his tone was empathetic and respectful. He followed with practical tips, which included words like schedule and reframe intimacy and as we age. Oh God, I wanted it to be over, but I did not look away. Partly because I appreciated his effort at directness, and partly because he hinted he knew about my podcast. So squirming uncomfortably would have been off brand.
You can stop it. I love that very much for a lot of reasons. But just tell us a little bit about trying to including that story and why do that? Nobody said, hey, Anna, how about you tell everybody who's reading the book and listening to the podcast about the OBGYN at Kaiser,
Well, I wanted to actually start there because I think as a culture right now, there's been a lot of really healthy movement in what the vocabulary is, the cultural vocabulary is around some parts of our sexual lives. I think there has been an incredible conversation about consent and affirmative consent and what that looks like, how to, what that means. There's also been really a lot of conversation. There's a lot of conversation always about dating and how dating is changing and hookup culture and what that looks like. And I wanted to start the book, the chapter about sex with just a different frame, which is like a married couple who've had a baby and for whom intimacy is important, but it's changed because there's a baby in the house. So, and I also wanted to demonstrate that there's a lot that I loved about that moment. And chiefly it was this Dr. Schechter at Kaiser in Oakland.
Shout out Dr. Schechter.
Everyone's had that doctor, I hope, who you think you're just kind of going in for the quick checkup, and maybe it's because he listened, that he said, oh, let's talk about this. And he asked me more about what were our hopes as far as having more children. I'm getting my birth control implant taken out. I'm making a joke about how hard it is to find time after you've had a baby. And it was in the interest as our conversation went on to say look, this is very common. This is not unusual. This is a pattern that happens for a lot of people. But it can be helpful to figure out how to talk about this in your relationship, because if you are sort of going from not being together very often to trying to get pregnant, that can create a lot of pressure, and that can create a lot of pressure and frustration when you don't have a sort of foundation of a sort of looser way of talking together in a relationship. And that was I so appreciated that. And I took it home. I was like, I've got homework from my doctor. I'm going to talk to my husband about this. So that's why I started the chapter there, because I just, I really appreciated that he was listening, and it shows something about a hard conversation, which is I wasn't saying I want to come and talk about, I'm over 35. I want to get pregnant again. I'm, worried about this. Please help me. I was making a joke. And he was like, let's talk about this. Doesn't have to be super heavy. Let's talk about it.
It's interesting you say that, maybe I can't quite remember what you exactly said, but hopefully everybody has a doctor like this, or everybody's had a doctor like this but that's not actually a guarantee. And I think that gets me to something else that's interesting about how you frame the book from the beginning. And you talk about having these hard conversations as something that goes beyond the personal. So I'm going to quote from the book. It says, "The scale of the work that's needed is overwhelming. With the decline of communities, civic institutions, and rituals, it's increasingly on individuals to rebuild connections on our own. Doing so means reaching out, supporting one another, and talking about the most difficult challenges we're facing." And that feels so true, and also in certain ways so maddening, because I think that the fact that societal scale work has to happen on an individual level is actually one of the problems that we have, and even, in terms of so many kinds of conversations. And I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit, and how you think about, maybe it's a function of this radical acceptance, but how you think about having these conversations on an individual level when what you're ultimately talking about is how to have them on a civic level.
Yeah. That was actually the big mission statement of the book, I actually believe that having these conversations in our personal lives and on a one-on-one basis is doing really important work of reinforcing and fortifying relational connections, community connections, and hopefully building back some of what's eroded over the course of certainly my lifetime. I was born in 1980. And I sort of came to that because, I grew up in West Virginia. I grew up going to a Unitarian church. My parents were parts of lots of clubs. My first bank account, I went in and I talked to a banker and sat at a desk and got a little book to keep all my deposits in. And as I entered young adulthood and now middle age, I have been struck by how much of I used to go to places to go through hard stuff. And I don't have that in my life now. Certainly some people still do, and that's wonderful. But when you look at statistics church going statistics and their declines, when you look at the kind of trust that people writ large have in sort of big institutions, whether it be business or media or the idea of institutions, Congress, that is all on the decline. And when you look at how our financial system has changed, for example, I just refinanced my mortgage and didn't see anybody in person, and it was all online, and it was all over email, and I was figuring it out by Googling and doing a lot of calculators and talking to friends. I had to say to people in my life, have you done this? Have you done this? Am I doing the right thing? And that was on me. And so that's part of why I think this book is not just it's interesting to talk about hard things in our relationships. It's actually whether you like it or not, the way our relationships work in America right now have changed so fundamentally that more of the onus is on us as individuals to start these conversations. And as you say, that, I'm not saying that's good. I'm saying it is, and I have this hope that as we all sort of gain back and think about the muscles we want to build, about how to sit with ambiguity, how to have relationships with people that we don't always agree with, maybe we'll come to build back some skills where there's some more ability to sort of join in to larger groups and movements in coalition for things like democracy to function. But I think it does start with figuring out how you are a part of these conversations and trying to do a better job in your most personal relationships.
It's such an interesting moment to be thinking about that, because I feel like all I've been doing for 2 years is talking about hard things, and not by choice. I mean, it's to go get a coffee with somebody, you have to do an extended interview about everybody's comfort level and health and vaccination status and preferences and masking, all this kind of stuff. And what would you say to somebody who just says, I'm tired of this, I want to opt out, I don't want to talk about any more hard things, I only want to talk to people I agree with, who I know are safe, I'm done doing this, I'm over it, I'm exhausted?
Oh, I think that's you can pick, you don't have to do it all the time. You don't have to talk about hard things all the time. I certainly don't endorse that. And I understand that feeling. I mean, I think everyone has moved into a period of exhaustion. And, it's maybe now when you're calling somebody and you're catching up, instead of going, how are you really? Maybe you're just telling funny stories about what your kids have done to keep it light. I think that in my life, I've noticed a sort of ebb and flow with tolerance for people just sitting and wallowing in what's difficult. But I do think it is, unfortunately, it's it reinforced the message of the book, which is whether you have liked it or not, each of us has probably had to figure out how to express condolences with words over a screen or in a card or over the phone in a way that maybe we wouldn't have had to if we could have just gone to a service and hugged the person who had lost someone they loved. And we lost that for a period. And for some of us, it's not come back. So it's I hope this book answers that need of I want to say, I want to express care, and I don't know how. How?
Yeah. Here's a how question. How do you make those decisions about when to have these conversations and when to let it go?
I mean, I think that that's something I thought about a lot when I was writing the chapter about family, and that chapter in particular is about focused on sort of family in adulthood. So grown up relationships in our families of origin. So adult children with their parents, and parents with their adult children, and siblings as adults. And like when you're in that space of sharing a common origin, but noticing there are ways that you have diverged and are different. And some families that's expected and fine. And some families that can be a source of sort of unspoken tension of like, oh, like she decided to do this, like, whereas all the other siblings did that. Is that some kind of judgment on the family culture? Are we going to talk about that sibling? Like, how do you make room for difference and individuation inside a family? And so part of that chapter, it starts with this idea of like, first of all, that's normal. If you feel like there are some ways that you feel connected and like you have this common history with a family, and also like there are ways in which you do not belong anymore, that's normal. That's what happens when we grow up, we individuate from our families of origin. But it can be tricky to think about like, well, when do I have this conversation with my parents about, that the people I want to be with, the person I want to marry does not at all look like the person that I think that they expect. When do I come out to them in that way? Or how do I talk to my, my stepfather who has totally opposite political views than I do, and there's a Trump rally down the street, but I have to stay in his home because my mom is sick, and so those are some examples in the book. And it's like the timing question, I wish I had a spot on calculator that I could offer to you. But I think it's about, in family, in any sort of ongoing relationship, it's probably not going to be one conversation. First of all, it's going to be this ongoing conversation. But I do think one thing that can be useful is how to sort of get out of the pattern of the way that you interact, whether it's a father or, a parent and their child, or siblings, like you get into your rhythm of how you have always interacted. And you can get out of that pattern by just, sort of signaling, again, with that idea of preparation, by saying like, I've been thinking about something that I want to talk to you about. It's important. Is now a good time? And maybe it's when you're together, maybe it's over the phone, but just like somehow signaling, I want to go into a different mode with you. And speaking of lack of control, you can't control how they're going to respond. It might not be a good time, and they might not be able to tolerate digging in with you in that way. It might be too uncomfortable. But you can try, and then you can, like, see how it goes. If it's not going, if you don't feel heard, if they can't listen, if you're not sort of feeling like you're both hearing each other, and there's that kind of back and forth, which I think in any hard conversation, you want to sort of, ideally the pace stays slow enough that you can track, okay, I'm listening now. I'm not sure I agree with what they're saying, so I'm going to wait, and then I'm going to say, I know that you said this. Here's how I see it. You can hear it spinning out when the pace quickens and when one of you gets flooded with emotion, and that's fine. That's normal and natural, but it's not sort of the intentional conversation that maybe you were intending when you started it. So then you can sort of try to come back to it, and time can help. Time can be an important thing that, if the conversation doesn't go well the first time you try to talk about something tough, it might be different in 6 months.
Part of what I think is remarkable about the book is there are certain examples where things sort of overall end up feeling worth it for people, and certain examples where it's more complicated. So there's a woman named Ellen who you interview who talks about coming out to her family as an adult, and she lives in this small town. And you write, everything that Ellen had long feared about coming out, rejection, scorn, and ostracization from her community, all happened. And I mean, and it's hard, and there's more to Ellen's. You spend a lot of time with this person and her story, and I don't want to flatten it, because there are also other things that she feels more free in many, many ways. But I think I highlight that passage in particular because you really do not shy away from the fact that the worst case scenarios that your anxiety brain produces, in fact, can happen. That's a possibility. It's not like by deciding to have this conversation, everybody rises to the occasion. That might not be the case. And in some cases that involves, a great deal of personal risk for people, emotional, and in some cases physical. And I think that you don't shy away from that at all in the book. I do think that there's the book, you obviously want to make the case for doing this anyway and having these hard conversations despite those kinds of risks. And so how do you think about that, or how should we think about that when we approach these different kinds of conversations? Like that worst case scenario, it might not be imaginary.
Yeah. I mean, I love knowing Ellen. Her name's Ellen Allen. She lives in West Virginia, where I'm from. And she, that's true. Like she grew up and was living as an adult in a very small town, and moved to a smaller city in West Virginia after she came out, because it was intolerable to be in her small town. There wasn't room for her to be a gay woman in her town. Like I feel, when I think about her story and what it sounded like as she was telling me and recounting these really difficult conversations, both with, she was married to a man, that marriage ended. Her mother has never accepted that she's a gay woman. Like those are very painful. They were painful conversations at the time. I think if you were to ask her, like, what is this story about? She would say it's about freedom, love, and, being myself. And she's madly in love with her wife. Ellen has chosen to continue to have a relationship with her mom, and she goes and visits her mom, and her wife is not welcome. And Ellen has chosen, because she's the only surviving child, there were 3 kids and she's the only one still living, that she will continue to have a relationship with her mother because her mother needs that. And she recognizes that it's not on the terms that she wishes that it was, but for her, she can see clearly what the relationship's constraints are, and she's decided that it's still important to have in her life. So I think of her story as one of like finding the courage again to face facts. When she was married to a man, she talked about having this book in her closet of erotica and this one particular story of a love scene between women. She'd read it so often the spine was broken in the book, and it just flopped open to this particular page. And so to hear her say that, like, she literally was reading it in the closet, so feeling like this could never be her life. And now she's married and deeply in love and deeply supported by her partner. So yeah, that's, in life, there are trade-offs.
Yeah. And how did she cope with that? I think that's part of what I'm trying to get at. Not that there isn't ultimately a positive takeaway for her from that experience, but how did she cope with that realization? Do you think that the worst outcomes happened, that everybody did not suddenly have a change of heart, though the facts she anticipated remained facts, I think that's the emotional leap for a lot of people, is you kind of think, okay, well, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it. And other people are okay. They're going to see me for who I am, or they're going to appreciate that I did this. And when that isn't the case, I think that can be sort of an emotional gut punch. And I think that's what to get past that, to that point of clarity about, okay, this is what this relationship is. The worst did happen, and I've found that I'm able to move on from that. Like, how did she talk about coping with that? And based on your interview, all the interviews you did for the book, how do you think we should approach that possibility for ourselves, knowing what might be on the other side?
Well, I think of her story as really about, yes, in fact, things that she feared, all came true, but because she approached these conversations first in her marriage, the marriage that ended, with her mother, with her now partner, because she brought a new kind of honesty to them, that created whole new spaces that she never could have imagined existing in her life. And so I think that that's the thing about hard conversations, like with any scary thing in life, you know, your anxiety tells you, but what if this happens, and what if this happens, and what if this happens? And your anxiety never says, or your forecasting never says, let's think about all of these incredible opportunities that might open up if I like get courageous, you know? And I think Ellen's story is that, which is like, yes, difficult things happened as a result of being honest about who she is, and painful things happened, and also wonderful things happened, and she wasn't denying herself. So I think that it's not, yeah, I don't think like honest conversations lead us to like happy endings always. I think that's really important. Like this book starts and ends with really the origin story of Death, Sex, and Money, the podcast I host. And this book is about kind of coming to this work because I was married and got divorced when I was around 30. And it was like this like shattering experience of just like the first time in my life when like something that I really didn't see coming hit me. And I was it was in that sort of in a sort of time of life where I was like, okay, I don't know how to do life. So I need other people to tell me how they've gotten through these tough moments. That was where the show came from. And in the epilogue of the book, I write about interviewing my ex-husband about the end of our marriage as sort of like, almost like to keep myself honest. Like here I am like setting myself up as someone who's like become skilled at difficult conversations. And I wanted to know if like, is that why our marriage ended? Because we just couldn't communicate? Like, could we have found our way if we had been more skillful? And what was really sort of, you know, it was like beautiful in its own way because enough time had passed. But to go back and talk with him about the like real moments of tension when we were coming to terms with that we wanted really different things in life, that was so sad and painful in the moment. But how I see those conversations now is like, oh, they were so sad and painful because what we were being honest about was really sad and painful, which is like, we thought we were going to build a life together and be together for the rest of our lives. And in fact, we wanted really different things. And as we got more honest about that together, it led us to this relationship is not going to have a future. And so I think, in fact, looking back on the conversations at the end of our marriage, it was because we finally got clear together, that's why we got to. But if you had told me, you know, when I got married, you're going to have some really successful hard conversations that are going to lead you to get divorced, I'd be like, we won't stop talking.
Right. Never mind. Forget it. Forget I said anything.
Yeah. So and it like makes you, this was my experience. Many people have it much earlier in their life, but like once you go through a hard thing and you realize like the bottom fell out and I survived, and like now I know I can survive, you become more courageous. And, I'm married again. We talk about hard things all the time. And it's like, it's just kind of like part of the mix of our relationship, because I'm like less afraid of what, I'm just more clear about like, let's be clear sooner. So we can just not be in, if some boulder is coming to us, I want to look at it together instead of pretending it's not coming and then get like rolled over.
What did you learn from writing the book? like you started out with this kind of mission statement and this idea, and I'm curious what's changed for you from writing the book. And also I'll add to that, since the book came out, because I think we are, I know it's impossible to get through a conversation without saying in these times, but a lot of things are very radically different, I think, even than probably when you started thinking about or writing the book.
Yeah, I mean, something I think about a lot and have thought about a lot since the book came out is how much I have been, my conversations and my relationships have been deepened. And I think the interviews that I do have been deepened by just sort of making room for ambivalence and making room for things to be two contradictory things to be true at once, and I am just so aware of how, as a culture, as a political culture writ large, there's just not a lot of room for that right now. So just I think that so many of our relationships can be served by remembering that you can say to one another, both this is true and this is true. And sometimes it doesn't make any sense, I love my aunt. I have really strong disapproval of where she's come down on the vaccine. Those two things are true. What do I do? And so what do I do with that? Do I decide that she's not somebody that I want to have in my life? Not right now, but do I decide that I don't want to have a family gathering with her in the cabin where we're all going to be unmasked? You know what I mean? So I think that that's something I think about a lot, is just the sort of spectrum of how we draw lines about who we can tolerate and who we can't, and in what situations.
So my last question, and then I think we can take questions from folks, is how should people use this book? What do you want us, what should we do? How should we take this forward into our own lives and our conversations?
I don't know. I think, I really love hearing from people about, how one particular, I've heard mostly from readers who have gotten something from the chapter about death and grieving and talking about death, and whether that's because of COVID related losses or also other losses. That's what I've heard the most from. So I hope if that's something that you are struggling with, that this book gives you company in that. I also I've really loved hearing from young people who sort of just like seeing and hearing from people talk about their messy moments. Because I think sort of when you're at the beginning of your adult life, you have this some of us, I did at least, had this idea of oh, I better not screw up, or everything's I gotta be on this path, I gotta figure it out. Stakes are high, and the stakes are high for young people right now, with student loan debt, et cetera. But so it's just having a modeling. I hope this book can model the learning as you go. And I hope it also just makes you curious about other people. I part of the joy of making this book was thinking about who I wanted to reach out to ask if they would share with me. And so I really like that it feels like it's a quilt of really different people's experiences going through hard things.
This gives me actually one really last question, I promise.
Okay.
And which is there anything you would add now if you were writing the book now?
Oh, sure.
in terms of a category of conversation.
A category. I don't know if I would add a category. I did, in my initial proposal, I had zillions of categories. And then I was like, this is very ridiculous and needs to be sort of edited down. I had, because I feel like conversations in the workplace are different than conversations in our personal lives. I had chapter about friendship, because I think friendship really matters in our lives, and we don't often have sort of models for how to deal with tension or change in our friendships. But I think it's sort of like this book hopefully has a feeling of like, even though it's a finished book, that it's like, it's in the spirit of like, that it can be a draft, and each of us is kind of like working on this as we go.
I love that as a note to end on. Thank you. And if anyone has questions, I think you can drop them into the chat, and Sandy will
Yeah.
tell
Well,
us what they are.
thank you so much for that amazing conversation. I want to be sure that you can see the book. Anna has it in the background there, but it's a wonderful book to read, and I've enjoyed different parts of it. I kind of opened to random pages and read it and then turn back. Anyway, Anna, I'm curious because my experience with younger people is that they don't talk at all to each other anymore.
Yeah.
And I worry about that a great deal. And I'm wondering if you would write a different book for that audience, or you expect them to be able to come to this and relate to it, or what can we do about these kids that will only text us?
I like to surprise them with phone calls. I've become like a proselytizer. I'm 41 and I work with a lot of people who are younger than me. And I'm just like, seriously, phone calls are great. You don't have to schedule them. You can, they're quicker than texting, like staring at a phone and waiting for the response, like, and it's done. And so, I don't know. I think that like, but in defense of texting, I do think that sometimes, like maybe for younger people, that is like the way they feel comfortable sort of like starting a conversation. Like they're just so uncomfortable on the phone. It's like foreign being on the phone. And in person, it can be just like not the place they're comfortable. So you can have sort of like the follow-up. There's a great story that a dad tells about like a follow-up text exchange he had with his son after his son was 13. They had a sort of like not great conversation. It ended quickly because he was dropping off his son, and just the like kind of doing the repair over text, where you're sort of reflecting on what the interaction was and expressing love. Like, I think that can be really useful. So, I do think like, yeah, so I think that texting can be useful. And also something I hadn't thought about was for people who think and speak differently, for people who are neurodivergent, sometimes texting can be something that allows them to feel more in control of what they're trying to communicate. So I'm sort of, agnostic when it comes to medium. I personally love the back and forth of a conversation. But it's most important that you sort of, figure out where you feel comfortable being the most honest.
Right. Okay. So you talked a little bit about, and it's in the book, about conversing with your ex-husband about what you wrote about the relationship. What about all the other people in your life that you wrote about or that are in the book? How did you navigate that territory? How much did you talk to them ahead of time? Did you show them drafts? I mean, this is a problem for anybody who writes a memoir, but why don't you talk about your experience with that?
Yeah. Thanks for asking that, because I feel actually really proud, and I thought a lot about what I wanted, how I wanted to do it. And I was inspired by Mary Karr has a book called The Art of Memoir. And there's a whole piece, I think pretty close to the beginning, about the reality of like bringing in your real life relationships into your art. And, that people do it different ways, but she takes that very seriously. She honors the relationship and wants them to know what's coming and talk with them about it before it comes out. And so that was actually, I write about my family a lot in the family chapter. And that was like the scariest part of it. Like the ex-husband was the most socially weird, like, hey, I'm writing a book. Hi, can I interview you? Hi, here's the draft. How do you feel? Anything you would, fact check or anything. So I shared pages with him, but I also did that with my father, with my mom, with my two older half sisters. I write about my dad's divorce. I'm part of my dad's second marriage. So I write about sort of like when you're in a family where you kind of come to realize that there was a history that preceded you that you didn't really understand and that you keep learning new dimensions of as you grow up. That was my experience in my family. So I wanted to make sure, I shared pages with all the family members that I mentioned and just say, like, does this feel, first of all, like, I want to share this with you. This is how I reflect on our relationship. And also, is this, is there anything you don't want me to write about publicly? And the notes back were like, it started a, conversation, which was cool. I got to hear how they would write about that time in their lives, or, so that was, I like that. I liked that. And I have come to, I appreciate when writers do that, and you can tell when they don't. You can tell when they secretly are writing things about people in their lives, and then it goes out into the public sphere. I think it's a scary but an important step.
Did you change the book after any of those conversations?
I did. There were some parts where I was like, oh, like I did choose to sort of winnow down the family memoir parts to like the parts of the family experience that I had kind of, that were through my lens. So I wasn't sort of recounting somebody else's argument with somebody else in the family. Like I wanted them all to be sort of things that I could inhabit.
All right, well, you've done such a good job, you two, that we have no other questions. And I want to thank you again for this really wonderful program and to highly recommend the book. And I also want to tell those of you in the audience, this program is recorded. We post it on the City Club YouTube channel. So if you want to share this evening with other people who weren't able to tune in tonight, we encourage you to do that. You go to the Berkeley City Club YouTube, you'll find not only this conversation, but about 16 others that we've done during the pandemic on Zoom. We hope that we'll be back in person maybe by next month or the month after. We don't know yet, but the program next month is Oakland History Podcast. And we're always on the first Wednesday of every month. So we encourage you to keep up with the events on the Berkeley City Club website. So thank you again, Casey and Anna. This has been a wonderful evening, and we just good luck with all your many projects, and know that I'm listening to you with my little earbuds in all the time when I walk around Berkeley.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.